The dust on Penelope's boots was the same color as the shame she carried, rust red and stubborn, clinging to everything it touched no matter how hard she tried to brush it away. She stood at the edge of Jerome, Arizona in the scorching July heat of 1882, one hand pressed against her lower back, and the other clutching a carpetbag that held everything she owned in this world, which amounted to 3 dresses, a Bible her mother had given her, and the last shreds of her dignity. The baby inside her was 4 months along, just beginning to show beneath the loose cotton of her traveling dress, and the father was somewhere in California by now, chasing gold claims and broken promises, while she faced the consequence of their summer romance alone. Jerome sat perched on Cleopatra Hill like a collection of children's blocks some giant had carelessly scattered across the mountainside, the buildings clinging to the steep slopes at angles that seemed to defy all logic and sense. Smoke rose from the smelters in gray-black columns that stained the sky, and even from where she stood, Penelope could hear the distant thunder of stamp mills crushing copper ore deep in the belly of the earth. She had come here because her cousin Sarah had written that there was work for respectable women, though Penelope wondered if she could still claim that word for herself. Respectable, now that her waist was thickening, and her secret was becoming harder to hide with each passing week. The stagecoach that had brought her rattled away in a cloud of dust, leaving her standing alone on the rutted dirt road that served as Jerome's main thoroughfare. Buildings rose on either side, some of them proper structures with glass windows and painted signs, others little more than canvas tents stretched over wooden frames. Men moved along the wooden sidewalks with the purposeful stride of those who had places to be and money to make, their faces shadowed beneath wide-brimmed hats, their boots leaving prints in the dust that the wind erased almost as quickly as they were made. Penelope took a breath that tasted of copper and creosote and started walking toward the address Sarah had given her, a boarding house on Hull Avenue where respectable women could rent rooms by the week. She kept her eyes down and her carpetbag clutched tight, acutely aware of every glance that slid her way, wondering if these strangers could somehow see through the fabric of her dress to the evidence of her mistake growing beneath. She had made it perhaps 50 yards when a man stepped out of a shop doorway directly into her path. Penelope pulled up short, startled, and looked up into a face that was all hard angles and sun-weathered skin, with eyes the color of creek water in spring, clear and gray-green and surprisingly gentle in that rough-hewn face. "Pardon me, miss," he said, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture that seemed automatic, bred into him by years of practice. "You look a bit lost. Can I help you find something?" Penelope's first instinct was to refuse, to claim she was perfectly fine and needed no assistance from any man. But the truth was she was hot and tired, and her back ached from hours on the stagecoach. And the address Sarah had given her might as well have been written in Greek, for all the sense it made to her now that she was actually standing in this jumbled mountain town. "I am looking for Mrs. Henderson's boarding house," she said, keeping her voice steady. "On Hull Avenue." The man nodded, a slow movement that suggested he did everything with that same measured deliberation. He was tall, built lean and strong in the way of men who worked with their bodies, wearing dusty canvas trousers and a shirt that had once been blue but had faded to the color of desert sky. A gun belt sat low on his hips, the holster tied down with a leather thong, and Penelope felt a flutter of unease at the sight of it, though nearly every man in Jerome seemed to go armed as casually as they wore hats. "Hull Avenue is just up the hill there," he said, pointing to where the street climbed even more steeply between rows of buildings that seemed to lean toward one another like tired old men. Mrs. Henderson's place is the white house with the green shutters, about halfway up on the left side. You cannot miss it. Thank you, Penelope said, meaning to move past him and be on her way, but he was looking at her with an expression she could not quite read, something that might have been concern or simple curiosity. You are new to Jerome, he said, and it was not a question. I arrived just now on the stage, Penelope admitted. My cousin Sarah works here, Sarah Norton. Perhaps you know her. I know Sarah, the man said, and something that might have been a smile touched the corners of his mouth. She works at the Mercantile, keeping the books. Good woman. She will be glad to see you. Penelope felt some of the tension ease from her shoulders at this confirmation that Sarah was indeed here, that the address she had traveled so far to reach was real and not some figment of desperate hope. Thank you again for your help. Name is Kyle Lawson, the man said, touching his hat brim once more. I work out at the Silver Crown mine, but I am in town most evenings if you or your cousin need anything. Welcome to Jerome, miss. He moved past her then, his boots making soft sounds on the packed earth, and Penelope stood for a moment watching him go. This stranger who had shown her a simple kindness without asking for anything in return. Then she turned and began the climb up Hull Avenue, her carpetbag growing heavier with each step, her breath coming shorter in the thin mountain air. Mrs. Henderson's boarding house was exactly where Kyle Lawson had said it would be. A narrow two-story structure painted white with shutters the color of spring grass. Penelope knocked on the door and waited, listening to the sounds of the town around her, the constant mechanical rumble of the mines, the shouts of men and the creak of ore wagons, the sharp bark of a dog somewhere in the distance. The woman who opened the door was small and round and gray-haired, with eyes that took in everything about Penelope in a single sweeping glance. Yes, I am Penelope Nash, she said. Sarah Norton is my cousin. She wrote to me that you might have a room to let, Mrs. Henderson's expression softened slightly. Sarah did mention you might be coming. Come in out of that heat. The inside of the boarding house was dim and blessedly cool after the glare of the afternoon sun. Mrs. Henderson led Penelope through a parlor furnished with horsehair chairs, and a piano that looked like it had seen better days, then up a narrow staircase to the second floor. I have one room available, she said, opening a door at the end of the hall. It is small, but it has a good bed and a window that catches the evening breeze. $3 a week, payable in advance, includes breakfast and supper but not lunch. The room was indeed small, barely large enough for the narrow bed, a dresser with a cracked mirror, and a washstand with a chipped basin. But it was clean, and the window looked out over the tumbled rooftops of Jerome to the valley beyond. And Penelope felt something in her chest ease at the sight of it, this small space that could be hers, where she could close the door and be alone with her thoughts and her growing secret. I will take it, she said, setting down her carpetbag and reaching into her pocket for the coins Sarah had sent her to cover the first week's rent. Mrs. Henderson pocketed the money and handed Penelope a key. Breakfast is at 6, supper at 7. No men above the first floor, no cooking in the rooms, no laundry hung from the windows. Sarah speaks well of you, so I will expect no trouble. There will be no trouble, Penelope said quietly, and hoped with all her heart that it was true. Sarah arrived just before supper, bursting into Penelope's room with a squeal of delight and wrapping her in a hug that squeezed the breath from her lungs. Sarah was 2 years older than Penelope's 22, plump and pretty with the same dark hair and blue eyes that marked them as family. Though Sarah's eyes held a sparkle that Penelope's had lost sometime in the month since Thomas had left. You are here. You are really here. Sarah said, holding Penelope at arm's length and looking her up and down. "Let me see you. Oh, Penny, you look exhausted. Was the journey terrible?" "Long," Penelope said, managing a smile, "but I am here now." Sarah's eyes dropped to Penelope's middle, where the loose dress could not quite hide the slight swell, and her expression shifted to something softer, more sympathetic. "How are you feeling? How far along?" "4 months," Penelope said. "I am well enough. Tired mostly, and my back aches, but the sickness has passed, thank God." Sarah took both of Penelope's hands in hers. "You are safe here. I know it must have been so hard facing this alone, but you have family now, and we will figure everything out together." Tears prickled at Penelope's eyes, the first she had allowed herself since receiving Thomas's letter 3 weeks ago. The one that had said he was staying in California, that he had met someone else, that he was sorry but he could not come back to marry her as he had promised. "I did not know where else to go. Mother would have died of shame, and Father would have turned me out anyway. I thought perhaps here, in a new place where no one knows me, I might be able to make a life for myself and the baby." "You will," Sarah said firmly. "There is work here, and people are too busy making money to worry much about anyone else's business. We will say you are a widow, that your husband died in a mining accident back in Colorado, and no one will question it. There are enough widows in the territories that one more will not raise eyebrows." They worked out the details over supper in Mrs. Henderson's dining room, keeping their voices low while the other boarders, 3 bachelor clerks, and an elderly widow named Mrs. Pritchard, ate their beef stew and biscuits in relative silence. Penelope would need a wedding ring, Sarah said, which could be bought cheaply enough at the pawn shop. She would need to practice her story until it came naturally. The tragic tale of a husband named John Nash who had died in a cave in last winter, leaving her alone and with child. Sarah would spread the word at the mercantile, and by the end of the week, everyone in Jerome would know about poor young Mrs. Nash, the widow from Colorado. It made Penelope's stomach twist with guilt. All these lies she would have to tell. But Sarah was right that the truth would only bring shame and censure. And Penelope had to think of the baby now, of giving this child a chance at something better than what her own cowardice and Thomas's betrayal had set in motion. She spent her first week in Jerome learning the steep streets and the rhythm of the town, which woke before dawn to the whistle of the mines and did not sleep until long after dark, when the saloons finally closed their doors and the last drunken miner stumbled home. Sarah got her work helping Mrs. Chen, who ran a laundry service out of a low building near the center of town. And though the heat of the irons and the steam from the washtubs left Penelope light-headed and aching by the end of each day, the work was simple enough, and Mrs. Chen asked no questions beyond whether the sheets were clean and the collars properly starched. She saw Kyle Lawson twice that first week, once when he came into the mercantile while she was visiting Sarah, and once when she passed him on the street near the boarding house. Both times he touched his hat and bid her good afternoon with that same quiet courtesy. And both times Penelope felt an odd flutter in her chest that she told herself was simply gratitude for his earlier kindness. "He is a good man," Sarah said one evening as they sat in Penelope's room after supper, Sarah mending a tear in one of her skirts while Penelope carefully let out the waist of one of her dresses to accommodate her growing belly. "Kyle Lawson, I mean. He has been in Jerome about 3 years now, works hard, does not drink over much or gamble away his pay. Some of the girls have tried to catch his eye, but he keeps to himself mostly." Penelope threaded her needle through the fabric, not looking up. "Why are you telling me this?" "No reason," Sarah said innocently. "Just making conversation." But Penelope knew her cousin well enough to hear the speculation in her voice, and she felt a flash of irritation. "I am not looking for a man, Sarah. I have had quite enough of men for a lifetime, thank you." "I am not suggesting anything," Sarah said. "I am just saying that not all men are like Thomas. Some of them are decent and kind and keep their promises." Penelope bit off her thread with more force than necessary. "I will remember that." 3 weeks into her time in Jerome, disaster struck in the form of Charlie Granger. Penelope was walking back from Mrs. Chen's laundry, tired and hot and thinking only of the cool room waiting for her at Mrs. Henderson's, when a man lurched out of the saloon ahead of her and planted himself in her path. He was drunk, swaying on his feet with a red face and whiskey breath that made Penelope's stomach turn. "Well now," he slurred, looking her up and down with bleary eyes. "Aren't you a pretty little thing? What say you come have a drink with me, darling?" "Excuse me," Penelope said firmly, trying to step around him, but he moved with her, blocking her way. "Now don't be unfriendly," Charlie said, reaching out to grab her arm. "I just want to get to know you better." Penelope jerked away from his touch, her heart hammering. "Leave me alone." "That is no way to talk to a man who is trying to be nice," Charlie said, his voice taking on an ugly edge. "You think you are too good for me. I heard about you, the widow from Colorado. Maybe you are not as respectable as you pretend." Before Penelope could respond, before she could even think what to do, a figure stepped between them, tall and solid and radiating quiet menace. Kyle Lawson did not raise his voice, did not even touch the gun at his hip, but something in his posture, in the cold look in those gray-green eyes, made Charlie stumble backward. "The lady asked you to leave her alone," Kyle said softly. "I suggest you do exactly that." Charlie opened his mouth as if to argue, then seemed to think better of it. He spat in the dust and turned away, weaving back toward the saloon with as much dignity as a drunk man could muster. Kyle watched him go, then turned to Penelope. "Are you all right?" Penelope was shaking, reaction setting in now that the danger had passed. "Yes, thank you. I do not know what he might have done if you had not been here." "He will not bother you again," Kyle said. "I will make sure of that." He paused, studying her face with that same gentle concern she had seen the first day they met. "Let me walk you home. It is getting late, and a lady should not be out alone after dark." Every instinct in Penelope wanted to refuse, to insist she needed no help from any man, but her hands were still trembling, and her stomach was churning with sick fear, and the truth was she did not want to walk the darkening streets alone. "All right," she said quietly. "Thank you." They walked in silence up Hull Avenue, the evening air cooling as the sun dropped behind the western mountains. Kyle matched his pace to hers, staying just slightly behind and to the side, as if understanding that she needed space, that she was not ready for anything that might seem like intimacy or expectation. At the door to Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, Penelope turned to thank him again, but the words caught in her throat when she saw the way he was looking at her. Not with the hungry calculation of men like Charlie Granger, but with something that might have been simple kindness, or perhaps the beginning of understanding. "If anyone bothers you again," Kyle said, "you tell me. Or better yet, you tell Mrs. Henderson and she will tell me. You should not have to deal with men like that." "I am grateful for your help," Penelope said. "Truly." Kyle touched his hat brim in that familiar gesture. "Good night, Mrs. Nash. Sleep well." He turned and walked away into the gathering darkness, and Penelope stood for a long moment with her hand on the door, watching him go and feeling something shift in her chest, something that might have been the first crack in the wall she had built around her heart. The next afternoon, Kyle appeared at Mrs. Chen's laundry with a bundle under his arm. Mrs. Chen looked up from her ironing board and called out to Penelope in rapid Cantonese, gesturing toward the front where Kyle stood waiting, hat in his hands. Penelope set down the shirt she had been folding and went to greet him, wiping her damp hands on her apron. "Mr. Lawson, is there something I can do for you? I brought my laundry," he said, holding out the bundle. "Mrs. Chen does mine usually, but I thought maybe you could use the business." Penelope took the bundle, feeling the weight of clean cotton and worn denim. "I work for Mrs. Chen. Any business you give her, you give to me as well." "Right," Kyle said, and for the first time since she had met him, he looked uncertain, almost awkward. "I just wanted to make sure you were all right after last night. Charlie Granger left town this morning on the ore wagon. He will not be back. You did not hurt him, did you?" Penelope asked, thinking of the gun Kyle wore and the cold look in his eyes when he had confronted Charlie. "Just had a talk with him," Kyle said. "Made it clear that he would be happier finding work in another town. He agreed with me." Penelope felt a complicated tangle of emotions at this news, gratitude and unease mixed together in equal measure. "You did not have to do that." "Yes, I did," Kyle said simply. "A man like that, he does not stop unless someone stops him. Better he moves on before he hurts someone." There was a conviction in his voice that spoke of experience, of things seen and done that he did not talk about, and Penelope found herself curious despite her determination to keep all men at arm's length. "Have you always lived in the territories?" "Texas, mostly, before I came here," Kyle said. "Worked cattle ranches down along the border, but there was trouble, and I thought it best to move on. Jerome seemed like a good place for a fresh start." "It does seem to be a place for that," Penelope said quietly. Kyle looked at her for a long moment, and Penelope had the unsettling feeling that he could see right through her carefully constructed lies, that he knew exactly what kind of fresh start she was looking for. But all he said was, "If you need anything, Mrs. Nash, you let me know. I mean that." "I will," Penelope said. "Thank you, Mr. Lawson." He nodded once and left, and Penelope stood holding his laundry bundle and trying to understand why this man's kindness made her want to cry. August came in hot and dry, the air so parched that water had to be hauled up from Prescott and sold by the barrel at prices that made Sarah shake her head in disgust. Penelope's belly grew rounder, impossible to hide now even with the loosest dresses, and she saw the way people looked at her, some with sympathy for the widow carrying her dead husband's child, others with speculation that made her skin crawl. But Sarah's story held, and if anyone doubted the tale of John Nash from Colorado, they kept their suspicions to themselves. Kyle became a regular visitor to Mrs. Chen's laundry, bringing his washing every week with the same quiet courtesy. Sometimes he would stay to talk while Penelope counted out his clean shirts and folded his work trousers, conversations that ranged from the weather to the price of copper, to the books Penelope borrowed from Mrs. Henderson's small library. He never asked personal questions, never pushed for more than she was willing to give, but his presence became something Penelope found herself looking forward to. A bright spot in weeks that were otherwise filled with backbreaking work, and the constant low-level fear of what would happen when the baby came. One evening in late August, Kyle found her sitting on the steps of the boarding house, fanning herself with a folded newspaper while the sun set in a blaze of orange and gold over the valley. He climbed the steps and sat down beside her, keeping a respectful distance, his long legs stretched out in front of him. "Hot today," he said. "Every day is hot," Penelope replied, but she was smiling despite herself. "Gets better in September," Kyle said. "Not much, but some." "You will be glad when the baby comes, I expect. Carrying that extra weight in this heat cannot be easy." It was the first time he had directly acknowledged her pregnancy, and Penelope felt her smile fade. "It is what it is. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. I will manage." "I am sure you will," Kyle said. "You are strong. I have seen that." Penelope looked at him, at the strong line of his jaw and the way the evening light caught in his eyes, turning them the color of sage after rain. "Why are you being so kind to me, Mr. Lawson? What is it you want?" Kyle was quiet for a long moment, and Penelope thought she had offended him, that he would get up and leave and she would have ruined this odd friendship that had somehow become important to her. But then he said, "I had a sister once. Her name was Mary. She got herself in trouble with a rancher's son down in Texas, and when she told him about the baby, he denied it was his and ran her off. My family did not handle it well. My father threw her out, called her terrible names, and my mother just stood there and cried and did not do a damn thing to stop him. Mary went to San Antonio and tried to make it on her own, but it is hard for a woman alone in that kind of situation. She died when the baby came. She was 19 years old. Penelope's throat tightened with grief for this girl she had never known, this sister who had faced the same fate Penelope herself was facing. "I am so sorry." "It was a long time ago," Kyle said. 10 years now. "But I swore then that if I ever had the chance to help a woman in that situation, I would do it. I would not stand by and let it happen again." "You are a good man, Kyle Lawson," Penelope said softly, and she felt the last of her defenses crumble as she said it, the wall around her heart finally giving way. "I try to be," Kyle said. He turned to look at her, and there was something in his eyes that made Penelope's breath catch. "Mrs. Nash, Penelope, I know we have not known each other long, and I know you have no reason to trust me, but I want to help you. Let me help you." "You have helped me," Penelope said, "more than you know." "That is not what I mean," Kyle said. He took a breath, and Penelope could see him gathering his courage. "Marry me." The words hung in the air between them, impossible and absurd and somehow terrifying in their sincerity. Penelope stared at him, certain she had misheard, that the heat had addled her brain. "What?" "Marry me," Kyle said again. "Give the baby my name. Let me take care of both of you. You would not have to pretend anymore, would not have to keep up this fiction about a dead husband. You would be respectable, truly respectable, and the child would have a father." "You do not even know me," Penelope said, her voice shaking. "You do not know what I have done, the mistakes I have made. I know you are brave enough to start over in a strange town where you knew no one but your cousin," Kyle said. "I know you work hard and keep your head up even when I can see it costs you. I know you love that baby even though it is not born yet, even though its father was a coward who ran away and left you to face everything alone. That is all I need to know." Tears were running down Penelope's face now, hot and fast and beyond her control. "Why would you do this? Why would you tie yourself to someone else's mistake?" "It is not a mistake," Kyle said fiercely. "That baby is not a mistake, and if you will let me, I will love that child like it is my own. I will give it my name and my protection and everything I have. And I will try my best to be a good husband to you, if you will have me." Penelope wanted to say yes, wanted it with a fierce longing that shocked her, but the wounds Thomas had left were still too raw. "I do not love you," she whispered. "I cannot promise you that I will." "I am not asking you to love me," Kyle said gently. "I am asking you to let me help you. If love comes later, then we will be blessed. If it does not, well, I will count it enough to know I did right by you and the baby." He stood then and held out his hand, and Penelope looked at it for a long moment, this offering of salvation and second chances. Then she put her hand in his and let him pull her to her feet, and when he smiled at her, the last of her resistance melted away. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you." They were married 4 days later by a traveling preacher who came through Jerome, once a month, to perform weddings and baptisms and funerals for those who wanted them. Sarah stood up with Penelope, and a miner named Tom Hadley who worked with Kyle stood up with him, and the whole thing took perhaps 10 minutes in Mrs. Henderson's parlor. with the landlady and Mrs. Chen and a handful of curious boarders looking on. Penelope wore her best dress, a dark blue cotton that Sarah had helped her alter to fit over her belly, and Kyle wore clean trousers and a white shirt and looked more nervous than Penelope had ever seen him. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Kyle kissed her gently on the forehead, a chaste touch that somehow felt more intimate than anything Thomas had ever done. After the ceremony, Kyle took her to the small house he rented on the edge of town, a two-room structure with a kitchen and sitting room in front and a bedroom in back. It was simply furnished but clean, with curtains on the windows and a quilt on the bed that Kyle said his mother had made before he left Texas. He set Penelope's carpet bag in the corner of the bedroom and then stood there looking uncertain, as if he did not quite know what came next. "I will sleep out front," he said finally. "On the floor by the stove you can have the bed." "This is your house," Penelope said. "Your bed, I cannot take it from you." "You are my wife now," Kyle said. "What is mine is yours, and in your condition you need proper rest." "I will be fine on the floor." They argued about it for a few minutes, but Kyle was stubborn in his quiet way, and in the end, Penelope gave in. She lay alone in Kyle's bed that night, listening to the sounds of him settling on the floor in the other room, and tried to understand how her life had changed so completely in the space of a few short hours. She was married now, bound to a man she barely knew, and yet she felt safer than she had in months, as if Kyle's presence in the next room was a shield against all the fears that had haunted her since the day Thomas left. The next weeks fell into a pattern that was surprisingly comfortable. Kyle left for the mine before dawn and returned after dark, tired and covered in rock dust, but always with a smile for Penelope and a question about how she was feeling. Penelope kept the little house clean and cooked their meals on the wood stove and tried to be the kind of wife Kyle deserved, though she still did not know exactly what that meant. He never pushed for more than she could give, never insisted on his rights as a husband. He continued to sleep on the floor in the front room, though Penelope could see that it left him stiff and aching in the mornings. He was unfailingly courteous, treating her with a gentleness that made her throat ache, and slowly, so slowly she barely noticed it happening, Penelope felt something shifting inside her, the fear and anger and hurt that Thomas had left behind beginning to heal. One evening in mid-September, Penelope was washing dishes when a sharp pain lanced through her lower back. She gasped and gripped the edge of the sink, breathing through it until it passed, then stood very still, waiting to see if it would happen again. Kyle looked up from the chair where he had been reading a week-old newspaper. "Penelope, are you all right?" "I think so," Penelope said. "It was just a cramp." But an hour later the pain came again, stronger this time, and Penelope knew with sudden certainty that the baby was coming early, a month before it was supposed to. Kyle went for the midwife, a German woman named Mrs. Schmidt, who had delivered half the babies in Jerome, while Sarah came and helped Penelope into bed. The labor went on through the night, long and difficult, and there were moments when Penelope was certain she was going to die, that this was God's punishment for her sin, and she would never live to see her child's face. But Kyle stayed with her through all of it, holding her hand and wiping her face with a cool cloth and telling her she was strong. She could do this, just a little longer. And when the baby finally came as the sun rose over the mountains, filling the little house with golden light, it was Kyle's face Penelope saw first, Kyle's eyes bright with tears as Mrs. Schmidt placed the squalling infant in Penelope's arms. "A boy," the midwife announced. "Small but healthy." "You did well, Mrs. Lawson." Penelope looked down at the tiny red face, The perfect miniature hands curled into fists and felt a love so fierce and overwhelming that it drove every other thought from her mind. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "Hello, my son." Kyle leaned over to look at the baby, and the expression on his face was one of such wonder and tenderness that Penelope felt her heart crack open. "He is beautiful," Kyle said hoarsely. "What will you name him?" Penelope had thought about this through the long months of her pregnancy, had considered and discarded a dozen different names. But looking at Kyle now, at this man who had given her and her child everything without asking for anything in return, she knew there was only one choice. "Henry," she said. "Henry Kyle Lawson, if that is all right with you." Kyle's eyes filled with tears that he did not try to hide. "That is more than all right. That is perfect, Mrs." Schmidt stayed for a few more hours to make sure both Penelope and the baby were doing well, then left with instructions to rest and send for her if there were any problems. Sarah brought food and helped Kyle change the sheets and generally fussed over Penelope until Penelope had to laugh and tell her to go home. She was fine, truly. When everyone was gone and the house was quiet, Kyle came and sat on the edge of the bed, looking at the baby sleeping in Penelope's arms. "Can I hold him?" Penelope passed Henry over carefully, showing Kyle how to support the baby's head, and watched as her husband cradled her son against his chest with infinite gentleness. Kyle gazed down at Henry with an expression of absolute devotion, and Penelope knew in that moment that he had meant every word he had said, that he would love this child as his own. "Thank you," Penelope said softly, "for everything. For giving him your name, for staying, for being here when I needed you most. I do not know how I can ever repay you." Kyle looked up, and the smile he gave her was radiant. "You do not need to repay me. You have already given me more than I ever hoped for, a family, a purpose, someone to come home to. That is worth more than all the gold in California." The words made Penelope think of Thomas, of his empty promises and his desperate chase after riches that he would probably never find, and she realized that she did not feel angry anymore, or even particularly sad. Thomas had given her Henry, and Henry had brought her to Kyle, and perhaps that was the way it was meant to be all along. "I am glad you walked into my path that first day," Penelope said. "I am glad you offered to help me find my way." "So am I," Kyle said. He handed Henry back to her and stood, stretching his back with a grimace. "You should rest now. I will be in the other room if you need anything." "Kyle," Penelope said, and he paused in the doorway. "You do not have to sleep on the floor anymore. There is room in the bed for both of us." "I trust you." She saw the surprise flash across his face, followed by something that might have been joy. "Are you sure?" "I am sure," Penelope said. "You are my husband. You should sleep in your own bed." That night, Kyle lay down carefully on the far side of the mattress, keeping a respectful distance between them, and Penelope fell asleep to the sound of his breathing and Henry's soft baby snuffles, feeling safer and more content than she had in longer than she could remember. The days that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and constant feedings, of learning how to care for an infant who seemed determined to cry at every hour. But Kyle was endlessly patient, walking Henry around the little house when Penelope was too exhausted to move, singing old cowboy songs in a surprisingly good baritone that never failed to soothe the baby into sleep. "Where did you learn those songs?" Penelope asked one night, watching Kyle pace back and forth with Henry draped over his shoulder. "Out on the range," Kyle said. "We used to sing to the cattle to keep them calm at night. Seems to work on babies too." Penelope laughed, the sound startling her with its unfamiliarity. When was the last time she had laughed, truly laughed? She could not remember. Kyle grinned at her. "There it is. I have been trying to make you laugh for weeks. I was starting to think maybe you did not know how." "I know how," Penelope said. I just forgot for a while." "Well, I will make it my personal mission to remind you," Kyle said. "Every chance I get." He was as good as his word. Over the following weeks, as Penelope recovered and Henry grew from a red-faced newborn into a rounder, calmer infant, Kyle found endless ways to make her smile. He brought her wildflowers picked from the hills above Jerome. He told her ridiculous stories about the other miners that could not possibly be true, but made her laugh anyway. He did the dishes without being asked and sang to the baby and built a proper cradle with his own hands, sanding it smooth so there were no rough edges. And slowly, so gradually that Penelope did not realize it was happening until it had already happened, she fell in love with her husband. It was not the wild, desperate passion she had felt for Thomas, that consuming fire that had burned so hot and so fast. This was something different, quieter and deeper, built on trust and kindness, and the thousand small ways Kyle showed her every day that she mattered to him. It was watching him make funny faces at Henry to make the baby smile. It was the way he always made sure she ate before he did, the way he rubbed her shoulders when they ached from carrying the baby, the way he looked at her like she was something precious. One evening in late October, when Henry was 6 weeks old and sleeping peacefully in his cradle, Penelope sat down beside Kyle on the small porch he had built onto the front of the house. The air was finally cooling, the brutal heat of summer giving way to the crisp chill of mountain autumn. Kyle had his arm stretched along the back of the bench, not quite touching her but close enough that Penelope could feel his warmth. "Kyle," she said softly, "I need to tell you something." He turned to look at her, and she saw wariness flicker in his eyes, as if he was bracing himself for bad news. "What is it?" Penelope took a breath and said the words she had been practicing in her head for days. "I love you. I do not know when it happened, but it did, and I needed you to know." The wariness melted into pure joy, Kyle's whole face lighting up like sunrise over the mountains. "You do?" "I do," Penelope said. "I love you, Kyle Lawson. You are the best man I have ever known, and I am grateful every single day that you chose to help me." Kyle cupped her face in his calloused hands and kissed her, and this time it was not the chaste peck of their wedding day but something deeper, full of promise and longing and hope. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Kyle pressed his forehead to hers. "I love you too," he said. "I have loved you since the first moment. I saw you standing there in the street with your carpet bag, and that stubborn look on your face like you were ready to fight the whole world. I love you, Penelope, and I love our son, and I will spend the rest of my life making sure you both know it." That night, for the first time, they came together as husband and wife in truth, and Penelope discovered that this too could be gentle and good, that a man's touch did not have to be selfish or heedless, but could be tender and careful and full of love. The next months passed in a haze of happiness that Penelope had never expected to feel again. Henry grew chubby and bright-eyed, learning to laugh and reach for things and roll over on the quilt Penelope spread on the floor for him. Kyle continued to work at the mine, but he was talking now about saving money to buy a ranch in the Verde Valley, a place where they could raise cattle and Henry could grow up with space to run. "Would you like that?" Kyle asked one Sunday afternoon as they sat watching Henry play with a set of wooden blocks Kyle had carved. "Living on a ranch, I would like anywhere as long as I am with you," Penelope said honestly. "But yes, I think I would like a ranch. Room to breathe, room to grow. It sounds perfect." "Then that is what we will do," Kyle said. "Another year or two here to save up the stake we need, and then we will find the prettiest spot in the valley and build our home." Life in Jerome went on around them, the constant churn of the mining camp with its booms and busts, its Saturday night brawls and Sunday morning prayers. Penelope became friends with some of the other wives, women like herself who had come west looking for something better, and found it in the arms of good men, and the tight-knit community of those trying to build lives in a harsh and unforgiving land. Sarah remained her closest confidante, visiting often and doting on Henry like he was her own. "You know," Sarah said one afternoon while Henry napped, and the two women sat shelling peas on the porch, "I was worried about you when you first wrote to say you were coming. I did not know how it would all turn out, but seeing you now, seeing you with Kyle and little Henry, I think everything worked out exactly as it was meant to." "So do I," Penelope said. She looked through the open door to where Kyle was fixing a loose board in the floor, his shirt sleeves rolled up and his face intent on his work, and felt a surge of love so strong it took her breath away. "I never thought I could be this happy. After everything that happened with Thomas, I thought my life was over, but Kyle showed me it was just beginning." Winter came to Jerome in a swirl of snow and howling wind, the temperatures dropping so low that water froze in the basin overnight. Kyle made sure their little house was tight against the cold, banking the stove high and stuffing rags in any cracks where the wind might seep through. Penelope worried about him walking to and from the mine in the dark and the cold, but he always came home safe, if covered in ice and half frozen. On Christmas Eve, Kyle surprised her by bringing home a small pine tree he had cut from the forest above town. They decorated it with paper chains Penelope made and popcorn they strung on thread, and Kyle carved a wooden star for the top. Henry, now 4 months old, stared at it in wonder, reaching for the lights from the candles they carefully lit. "This is our first Christmas as a family," Kyle said, holding Penelope close while they watched Henry watch the tree. "The first of many." "The first of many," Penelope agreed, and thought about how far she had come from that frightened, ashamed girl who had stepped off the stagecoach in July. That girl had been running from her past, but Penelope Lawson was building a future, and the difference was everything. The new year of 1883 came in with a cold snap that lasted through January and into February. The mines worked through it, as they always did, and Kyle came home each night with stories of frozen equipment and ice-slicked tunnels and men huddled around warming fires. But he also came home with his pay, saving every cent he could spare in a tin box he kept hidden under a loose floorboard. "We are almost there," he told Penelope one night in early March as he counted out the bills and coins. "Another 6 months, maybe 8, and we will have enough to buy land and stock it properly. Then we can leave this place and make our ranch." Henry had started teething by then, fussy and drooling and making everyone's nights miserable. Penelope walked the floor with him for hours, singing the same songs Kyle had taught her, and Kyle took over when he got home from work, never complaining even though he had to be exhausted. One evening when Henry was particularly difficult, refusing to be soothed by anything, Kyle took him outside despite the chill in the air. Penelope watched through the window as Kyle walked their son around the small yard, pointing up at the stars and talking to him in a low murmur she could not quite hear. After a few minutes, Henry stopped crying, mesmerized by his father's voice and the glittering darkness above. When Kyle brought him back inside, Henry was drowsy and content and Penelope was crying. "What is wrong?" Kyle asked, alarmed. "Are you hurt?" "No," Penelope said, wiping at her eyes. "I am fine. It is just watching you with him. I was thinking about how lucky we are, how lucky I am." "You did not have to do any of this, Kyle. You did not have to marry me or claim Henry as yours. But you did, and you never make us feel like we are a burden or an obligation. You love us. Really, truly love us." "Of course I do," Kyle said, like it was the simplest thing in the world. "You are my family. You are everything." He handed her the baby and pulled her close, and they stood there in the middle of their little house, the three of them together. And Penelope knew that no matter what else happened in her life, she would always remember this moment, this perfect moment of complete and utter happiness. Spring came slowly to the mountains, the snow melting in patches and revealing the brown earth beneath. Wildflowers began to bloom in the hills, and the air lost its bitter edge. Henry was 7 months old now, sitting up on his own and babbling nonsense syllables that Kyle insisted were attempts to say, "Papa." "He is clearly saying Mama," Penelope corrected, and they would argue about it good-naturedly while Henry grinned at them both, delighted to be the center of attention. In April, disaster struck the Silver Crown mine. There was an explosion deep underground, something to do with gas pockets and a careless miner with a lantern. Kyle was on a different level when it happened, but 4 men died and a dozen more were injured. The mine shut down for 2 weeks while they cleared the rubble and shored up the damaged tunnels, and those 2 weeks without pay cut into the savings Kyle had worked so hard to build. Penelope saw the frustration on his face as he counted the money again, saw the way his jaw tightened when he realized how much longer it would take now to reach their goal. "It is all right," she told him. "We have time. There is no rush." "I want to get you out of here," Kyle said. "I want to give you and Henry something better than this camp, with its smoke and its noise and its danger." "You have already given us everything that matters," Penelope said. "The ranch will happen when it happens. Until then, we have each other, and that is enough." The mine reopened in May, and Kyle went back to work with the same steady determination he brought to everything. But Penelope could see that the explosion had shaken him, had reminded him of how dangerous his work was, and how quickly a man's luck could run out. She started taking in sewing to add to their savings, mending clothes and making simple dresses for the women in town. The money was not much, but every little bit helped, and it gave Penelope a sense of contributing, of doing her part to build the future they both wanted. One warm June evening, Kyle came home with a man Penelope had not met before, a weathered rancher named Bill Tucker who owned land down in the Verde Valley. They sat on the porch while Penelope brought out coffee, and she listened as Bill told them about a parcel he was looking to sell, 160 acres with good grass and water, and a small cabin already built. "I am getting too old to work it properly," Bill said. "My son is not interested in ranching, wants to try his luck in California. So I am selling off my holdings piece by piece. This particular parcel, I would let it go for $800, which is a damn good price for that much land with water rights." Kyle glanced at Penelope, and she could see the question in his eyes. They had $700 in the tin box, not quite enough but close. She nodded, and Kyle turned back to Bill. "We are interested," he said, "but we would need a few more months to get the full amount together. Would you be willing to hold it for us?" Bill considered, stroking his grizzled beard. "I will tell you what. You give me $500 now as a deposit, and you can pay the rest when you move down. I trust Kyle Lawson to be good for his word." Kyle looked at Penelope again, and this time she saw hope blazing in his eyes, bright and fierce. "We can do that." They shook on it that night, and Bill promised to have the papers drawn up. When he left, Kyle swept Penelope into his arms and spun her around, both of them laughing while Henry clapped his hands from his place on the quilt. "We are going to have our ranch," Kyle said. "We are really going to do it." "We are," Penelope agreed, and kissed him hard and long, not caring that the neighbors might see. They spent the next week, planning and dreaming, talking late into the night about what crops they would plant and what stock they would buy, and how they would build the ranch into something that would support not just them, but the children Penelope hoped they would have. Henry was there first, but she wanted more, wanted to fill that cabin in the Verde Valley with the laughter of brothers and sisters. "How many children do you want?" Kyle asked one night as they lay in bed, Penelope curled against his side with her head on his shoulder. "4, maybe 5, Penelope said. "I know that is a lot, but I love being a mother. I love watching Henry grow and learn. I want more of that." "Then we will have more," Kyle said, pressing a kiss to her hair. "As many as you want. I like the idea of a house full of children." "Even if they keep you up at night and eat you out of house and home," Penelope teased. "Even then," Kyle said seriously. "Family is everything, Penelope. I did not have a good one growing up, not after what happened with Mary. But with you, with Henry, I have a second chance. I am not going to waste it." In July, exactly 1 year after Penelope had first arrived in Jerome, Kyle gave notice at the Silver Crown mine. They would leave in August. He told the foreman as soon as they could pack up their belongings and arrange transport for everything to the Verde Valley. The news spread quickly through the small community, and their last weeks in Jerome were filled with farewell visits from the friends they had made. Sarah cried and made Penelope promise to write every week. Mrs. Chen gave them a set of fine porcelain cups that Penelope knew the older woman could not really afford to part with. Even Mrs. Henderson got teary-eyed when they said goodbye, pressing a jar of her homemade preserves into Penelope's hands. "You are a good woman, Penelope Lawson," Mrs. Henderson said. "You have come through fire and come out stronger on the other side. I am proud to have known you." The words made Penelope cry, and she hugged the older woman tight, grateful for the kindness she had been shown when she needed it most. They left Jerome on a bright August morning, all their possessions loaded into a wagon Kyle had bought for the journey. Henry sat between them on the bench seat, almost a year old now and fascinated by everything he saw. Penelope looked back once as they started down the mountain road, at the town that had given her shelter and hope and a second chance at happiness. And then she turned forward, toward the valley, and the future, and the life she would build with the man she loved. The ranch was everything Bill Tucker had promised and more. The cabin was small but solid, with a stone fireplace and real glass windows, and a view of the Verde River winding through the valley like a silver ribbon. The land stretched out in all directions, covered in grass that would feed cattle, with stands of cottonwoods along the riverbank providing shade and shelter. "It is perfect," Penelope breathed, standing in the doorway of the cabin with Henry in her arms. "It is home," Kyle said, and carried their first load of belongings inside. They spent the rest of August and all of September settling in, making the cabin comfortable and starting the work of building a ranch. Kyle bought 20 head of cattle from a neighbor and built a corral and started clearing land for crops. Penelope made curtains for the windows and planted a kitchen garden and learned how to churn butter and make cheese from the milk of the cow Kyle bought her. It was hard work, harder than anything Penelope had ever done, but it was good work, satisfying in a way that taking in laundry had never been. She fell into bed exhausted every night, and woke every morning to the sound of birds and the sight of sunlight streaming through the windows, and knew that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Henry thrived in the open air and space, learning to walk by pulling himself up on fence rails and toddling after the chickens Kyle bought. He was fearless and curious and into everything, and Kyle doted on him shamelessly, carrying him on his shoulders and teaching him the names of the animals and the crops. One evening in late September, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the valley, Kyle reached over and took Penelope's hand. "Are you happy?" he asked. "Happier than I ever thought I could be," Penelope said honestly. "This is everything I wanted, Kyle. Everything I dreamed of but did not think I deserved." "You deserve all of this and more," Kyle said. You deserve every good thing in the world." He was quiet for a moment, then said, "I have been thinking about something, about Henry." "What about him?" Penelope asked, watching their son play with a carved horse Kyle had made him. "He calls me Papa," Kyle said. "Has for months now. And I know legally he has my name, but I want it to be real. I want to adopt him formally, make him mine in every way that matters. Would that be all right with you?" Penelope's eyes filled with tears. "Kyle, he is already yours in every way that matters. You are his father. You have been since the day he was born." "I know, but I want it legal," Kyle insisted. "I want there to be no question, no way anyone can ever say he is not my son. Will you let me do that?" "Of course," Penelope said, her voice thick with emotion. "Nothing would make me happier." They went to Prescott in October and found a lawyer who drew up the adoption papers. Kyle signed them with a flourish, and when the lawyer stamped them with his seal and declared it official, Kyle picked up Henry and held him tight. "You are mine now," he murmured into the child's dark hair. "My son. Forever." Penelope wiped at her eyes and thought about Thomas, who had never even seen his child, who had run away from his responsibilities and probably did not even know whether Penelope had given birth to a boy or a girl. She wondered if he ever thought about them, if he ever regretted his choice. Then she decided she did not care. Thomas was the past, a ghost that had no power over her anymore. Kyle was her present and her future, and Henry was their son, and that was all that mattered. Winter that year was mild, the snow light and the temperatures never dropping much below freezing. Kyle used the quiet months to make improvements to the cabin, adding a second room that would serve as a bedroom for Henry as he got older, and a proper storage shed for their tools and supplies. He also bought 3 horses from a traveling trader, good sturdy animals that would be useful for working the cattle, and for getting to town when they needed supplies. Penelope spent the winter teaching herself to cook better, to make bread that did not turn out heavy and dense, to roast meat so it stayed tender instead of turning tough. She also taught herself to read better, using the books they had brought from Jerome, and in the evenings she would read aloud to Kyle and Henry. Their little family gathered around the fireplace while the wind howled outside. In February, Penelope realized she was pregnant again. She had been feeling tired and queasy for weeks, and when she finally missed her monthly courses, she knew. This time, there was no fear or shame, only joy and excitement. She told Kyle one evening after they had put Henry to bed, and his reaction was everything she could have hoped for. He let out a whoop of delight and picked her up, spinning her around until she was dizzy and laughing. "Another baby. We are going to have another baby. Careful," Penelope said, breathless. "Put me down before you make me sick." Kyle set her down gently and knelt in front of her, pressing his cheek against her still flat belly. "Hello in there, little one. I am your papa, and I cannot wait to meet you." Penelope ran her fingers through his hair, feeling a love so vast and deep that it seemed impossible one human heart could contain it all. "I love you, Kyle Lawson." "I love you too, Penelope Lawson," Kyle said, looking up at her with those gray-green eyes that had seen her at her worst and loved her anyway. "I love you too." The baby came in late September of 1884, another boy they named James after Kyle's grandfather. The birth was easier than Henry's had been, and Penelope recovered quickly, eager to get back to the work of running the ranch. Henry, now 2 years old, was fascinated by his baby brother, wanting to hold him and touch him and bring him toys. "Gentle," Penelope reminded him constantly. "Be gentle with the baby." And Henry would nod solemnly and pat James's head with exaggerated care, and Kyle would grin and say that Henry was going to be an excellent big brother. The ranch prospered over the next few years. The cattle herd grew, and Kyle's reputation as a fair and hard-working man spread through the valley. Neighbors came to him for advice and help, and he was always generous with both. Penelope made friends with the other ranch wives, women who understood the challenges and rewards of trying to build something lasting in this wild country. In 1886, they welcomed their third child, a girl they named Grace. She was tiny and perfect, with Kyle's gray-green eyes and Penelope's dark hair, and both Kyle and Penelope were utterly besotted with her. Henry and James treated her like a living doll, always wanting to hold her and help care for her, and Penelope's heart swelled with gratitude for this family she had been given, this second chance at happiness. One afternoon in the spring of 1887, Penelope was hanging laundry on the line while Grace napped and the boys played in the yard when a rider came up the road toward the house. She did not recognize him at first, just saw a man on a tired-looking horse, his clothes dusty from travel. But as he got closer, something about the way he sat his horse, the shape of his shoulders, made Penelope's blood run cold. Thomas. He reined in near the porch and climbed down, moving slowly like a man who had been riding for a long time. He was thinner than Penelope remembered, his face more lined, his eyes shadowed with something that might have been regret or might just have been weariness. "Penelope," he said, his voice rough. "I heard you were living out here. I wanted to see you." Penelope's hands tightened on the wet sheet she was holding, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. 5 years. It had been 5 years since he had left, since she had gotten his letter saying he was not coming back. And now here he stood, as if he had every right to ride onto her land and speak her name. "What do you want, Thomas?" she asked, her voice cold. Thomas took off his hat and twisted it in his hands, a nervous gesture she remembered from when they were courting. "I wanted to see you, to apologize." "I know I did you wrong, Penelope. I have been living with that for years. I tried to make something of myself in California, but it did not work out the way I thought it would. I lost everything. And I realized I had lost the most important thing of all when I left you." "You are 5 years too late for apologies," Penelope said flatly. "I do not want them, and I do not need them." Thomas's eyes flicked to the boys playing in the yard, to Henry, who was now 5 years old and tall for his age, with Kyle's broad shoulders already beginning to show. "Is that him?" "Is that the boy?" "That is Henry," Penelope said. "My son, mine and Kyle's." "But I am his father," Thomas said, something desperate entering his voice. "I am his real father. Does he know? Does he know about me?" "No, and he never will," Penelope said fiercely. "You gave up any right to call yourself his father when you abandoned us. Kyle is Henry's father. Kyle has been his father since the day he was born. You are nothing to him, nothing to any of us." She saw hurt flash across Thomas's face, followed by anger. "You cannot keep him from me." "I have rights. He is my blood." "You have no rights here," a voice said from behind Penelope, and she turned to see Kyle walking toward them from the barn, his rifle in his hands. He was not pointing it at Thomas, not yet, but the threat was clear. Thomas's eyes widened and he took a step back. "I do not want trouble. I just wanted to see my son." "He is not your son," Kyle said, his voice hard as stone. "He is mine. I have the papers to prove it. I adopted him legally, and his last name is Lawson, not whatever yours is. You have no claim on him." "But he is my blood," Thomas repeated, and now he just sounded lost. "He is all I have left." "You should have thought of that before you ran," Kyle said. "Now I am going to ask you once politely to get back on your horse and ride away from here. Do not come back. Do not try to contact Penelope or Henry or anyone in our family. You had your chance and you threw it away. This is mine now. They are mine. And I will do whatever it takes to protect them. Do you understand me?" Thomas looked at Penelope. And she saw the plea in his eyes, the desperate hope that she would intervene, that she would tell Kyle to put down the gun and let Thomas stay. But Penelope felt nothing, no sympathy, no old affection, nothing but a fierce need to protect the family she had built with Kyle. "Goodbye, Thomas," she said. "Do not come back here, we have nothing for you." Thomas's shoulders slumped in defeat. He put his hat back on and climbed onto his horse, moving like an old man though he could not have been more than 30. He looked down at Penelope one last time, and she thought he might say something else, make one more attempt to claim what he had abandoned. But then he just turned his horse and rode away, back down the road and out of their lives. Kyle waited until Thomas was out of sight before he lowered the rifle and turned to Penelope. "Are you all right?" "I am fine," Penelope said, and realized it was true. Seeing Thomas again had not hurt the way she thought it might. He was just a stranger now, someone she used to know, and whatever power he had once held over her was gone, burned away by 5 years of love and security and building a life with Kyle. Kyle pulled her into his arms and held her tight, and Penelope buried her face in his shoulder and breathed in the familiar scent of him, leather and soap and sunlight. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what? For protecting us. For being here. For being the man Thomas never could be." "I will always be here," Kyle said. "Always. That is a promise." They never saw Thomas again. Penelope heard through neighbors that he had left the territory entirely, gone back east to try his luck in one of the big cities. She did not know if it was true and did not care. He was part of a past she had left behind, as dead to her, as if he had never existed at all. The years continued to pass in a succession of seasons, each bringing its own challenges and joys. The ranch grew and prospered, becoming one of the most successful in the Verde Valley. Kyle bought more land, expanded the herd, hired on hands to help with the work. Penelope kept the books and managed the household and raised their growing family with love and firmness. In 1889, she gave birth to another boy, Matthew, and in 1891, another girl, Ruth. Their house was always full of noise and laughter, of children running and playing, of dinners around the big table Kyle had built with his own hands. Penelope had never imagined she could be this happy, that a life that had started with shame and fear could transform into something so beautiful. Henry grew into a strong, capable young man who helped his father with the ranch work and never once asked about the circumstances of his birth. If he noticed that he looked nothing like Kyle, he never mentioned it. As far as he was concerned, Kyle was his father in every way that mattered, and that was enough. One evening in the summer of 1895, when Henry was 13 and already taller than Penelope, she found him sitting on the porch watching the sunset. She sat down beside him, and for a few minutes they were quiet, just enjoying the cool evening air and the sounds of the ranch settling down for the night. "Mama," Henry said finally, "can I ask you something?" "Of course," Penelope said. "Some of the boys in town, they say I do not look like Pa. They say maybe I am not really his son. Is that true?" Penelope's heart clenched. She had known this conversation might come someday, but she had hoped it would be later, when Henry was older and better able to understand. "It is true that your father and I were not married when you were born," she said carefully. "But he chose to be your father anyway. He chose us. And he loves you just as much as he loves your brothers and sisters, Henry. Never doubt that." "I do not doubt it," Henry said. "I just wanted to know." "So what do I tell the boys in town when they say things?" "You tell them that Kyle Lawson is your father and always has been," Penelope said firmly. "You tell them that family is not just about blood. It is about love and commitment and being there when it matters. Your father has been all of those things and more. That makes you his son." Henry nodded slowly, processing this. "I am glad he is my pa," he said. I would not want anyone else." "Neither would I," Penelope said and hugged her son tight. That night, she told Kyle about the conversation and he was quiet for a long time. "Do you think I should tell him the whole truth?" he asked finally. "That I adopted him, that there was another man?" "Not unless he asks," Penelope said. "Right now, all he needs to know is that you are his father and you love him. The rest is history that does not matter anymore." "It matters to me," Kyle said. "Because if Thomas had not left, if he had married you and claimed Henry, I never would have found you. I never would have had this family, this life. So in a way, I am grateful to him for being a coward. It gave me everything I ever wanted." Penelope kissed him softly. "I am grateful too, for all of it, even the hard parts, because they led me to you." The new century came in with a flurry of excitement and speculation about what the future might hold. Henry was 17 now, talking about staying on the ranch and working with Kyle to build it even bigger. James was 15 and interested in horses, spending all his free time training colts and learning everything he could about breeding and bloodlines. Grace was 13 and beautiful, and already attracting the attention of boys at church, much to Kyle's dismay. Matthew was 10 and wild, always getting into trouble, and Ruth was 8 and sweet, the baby of the family who had everyone wrapped around her little finger. One afternoon in the spring of 1900, Penelope was working in her garden when Kyle came and stood beside her, watching her work. She looked up at him, at the gray now threading through his dark hair and the lines time had carved into his face, and thought he had never looked more handsome. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "How lucky I am," Kyle said. "Standing here watching you work in the garden of our home, with our children healthy and happy, with the ranch doing well. I was just thinking about that day I met you in Jerome, how lost you looked, how scared. And I was thinking about how far we have come since then." "We have come very far," Penelope agreed, setting down her trowel and standing up to brush the dirt from her hands. 18 years. Can you believe it has been that long? 18 years since I saw you standing in the street with your carpet bag," Kyle said. 18 years since I fell in love with you at first sight." "You did not fall in love with me at first sight," Penelope laughed. "You barely knew me." "I knew enough," Kyle said seriously. "I knew you needed help, and I knew I wanted to be the one to give it to you. The rest just followed naturally." He pulled her into his arms, heedless of the dirt on her dress and her hands, and kissed her with the same passion he had shown on their first real night together. Penelope kissed him back, pouring 18 years of love and gratitude into it, and when they finally pulled apart, they were both smiling. "I love you, Kyle Lawson," Penelope said. "I love you too, Penelope Lawson," Kyle replied. "Now and always." The years that followed were good ones. Henry married a sweet girl named Lucy from a neighboring ranch, and they built a house on the edge of the property and started a family of their own. James decided to start a horse breeding program, and with Kyle's support, he built it into something that brought in almost as much money as the cattle. Grace married a young lawyer from Prescott and moved to town, though she visited often with her growing brood of children. Matthew settled down eventually and became the ranch foreman, working alongside his father to manage the operation. And Ruth, the baby, surprised everyone by declaring she wanted to be a teacher and going off to normal school in Flagstaff. Kyle and Penelope watched their children grow and flourish, watched their grandchildren come into the world, and felt the satisfaction of knowing they had built something that would last long after they were gone. One evening in the summer of 1912, 30 years after they had first met, Kyle and Penelope sat on the porch of their ranch house watching the sun set over the valley. They were both gray now, moving a little slower than they used to, but their hands were still clasped together the way they had been for 3 decades. "You ever think about him?" Kyle asked quietly. "Thomas. Do you ever wonder what happened to him?" "No," Penelope said honestly. "He has been gone from my thoughts for so long that I can barely remember what he looked like. You are the only man I think about, Kyle. You are the only man who matters." Kyle squeezed her hand. "I think about Mary sometimes. My sister. I think about how her life could have been so different if someone had just given her a chance, the way I tried to give you a chance. I hope wherever she is, she knows that I tried to make things right, that I tried to honor her memory by doing better." "You did more than that," Penelope said. "You saved me, Kyle. You saved me and Henry both. You gave us a life and a family and more happiness than I ever thought possible. Mary would be proud of you, I am sure of it." They sat in comfortable silence as the sky darkened, and the stars came out one by one, the same stars they had watched together for 30 years. And Penelope thought about that frightened girl who had stepped off the stagecoach in Jerome with her shameful secret and her uncertain future. And she wished she could go back and tell that girl that everything was going to be all right, that a cowboy with kind eyes was going to offer to help her, and that help was going to turn into love, and that love was going to turn into a lifetime of joy. But she could not go back, could only go forward, and that was all right because the future she had built with Kyle Lawson was better than anything she could have imagined in those dark days when she thought her life was over. "I love you," she said again, because the words never got old, never lost their power. "I love you too," Kyle said, and lifted her hand to his lips to press a kiss against her knuckles. "Always have, always will." And as they sat there together in the gathering darkness, surrounded by the land they had worked and the family they had built, and the love that had sustained them through good times and bad, Penelope knew with absolute certainty that she had been blessed. Thomas had left her alone and pregnant and terrified, but Kyle had stayed. Kyle had claimed Henry as his own, had given them both his name and his protection and his love, and that had made all the difference. The ranch continued to thrive through the years, passed down from generation to generation. Henry's children worked the land alongside Matthew's, and Grace's grandchildren came to visit every summer, filling the old house with laughter and noise. James's horses became famous throughout Arizona Territory, sought after for their speed and endurance and good temperament. Kyle and Penelope lived to see their golden wedding anniversary, celebrated with a huge party that brought family and friends from all over the territory. By then they were both white-haired and wrinkled, but their love for each other had not dimmed one bit. If anything, it had grown stronger over the years, deepened by shared joys and sorrows, by children raised and grandchildren welcomed, by a life built together one day at a time. On the day of the party, Henry stood up to make a toast. He was 50 years old now, with children and grandchildren of his own, and when he looked at Kyle, there was nothing but love and gratitude in his eyes. "To my father," Henry said, raising his glass. "Kyle Lawson. The best man I have ever known. He did not have to take me in, did not have to give me his name, but he did. And because of that, I have had a life filled with love and security and opportunity. Everything I am, everything I have, I owe to him, to Pa." Everyone cheered and drank, and Kyle had tears running down his weathered cheeks. He stood up slowly, his joints stiff with age, and looked around at all the faces gathered there, all the people who had come from his choice to help a frightened young woman in a dusty mining town 30 years ago. "I am the lucky one," Kyle said, his voice still strong despite his age. "I got to spend my life with the woman I love, raising a family I am proud of. I got to build something that will last long after I am gone. That is more than most men ever get, and I am grateful for every moment of it." He sat down, and Penelope took his hand, and they smiled at each other with the understanding that comes from decades of shared life. When Kyle passed away in the winter of 1915, he was 82 years old and had been working cattle right up until the end. He went peacefully in his sleep, with Penelope beside him holding his hand, and his last words were, "I love you." Penelope grieved him fiercely, but she did not fall apart. She had 50 years old now, but their children took care of her, made sure she wanted for nothing. She lived another 10 years, long enough to see the ranch continue to prosper, long enough to hold great-great-grandchildren in her arms and tell them stories about their great-grandfather Kyle, the cowboy who had saved her and changed her life. When Penelope died in her sleep in 1925, she was 84 years old and surrounded by family. Her last conscious thought was of Kyle, of his kind gray-green eyes and gentle smile, and she went to him gladly, knowing that death was not an ending but simply the next chapter in their story. They buried her beside Kyle on a hill overlooking the ranch, and Henry placed a simple marker that read, "Penelope Nash Lawson, beloved wife, mother, and grandmother." She was loved, and she had been. For 50 years, she had been cherished and valued and adored by a man who had chosen her when she had nothing to offer but a scandal and a baby that was not his. Kyle had seen past all of that to the woman beneath, had loved her not despite her past, but simply for who she was in the present. And that love had been the foundation of a life that neither of them could have built alone. The ranch still stands today, worked by the descendants of Henry and his siblings, a testament to what two people can build when they choose love over judgment, commitment over convenience, and family over blood. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the sun sets over the Verde Valley in streaks of orange and gold, people say you can see two figures sitting on the porch of the old house, hand in hand, watching the day end and the stars come out, together for all eternity just as they were for 50 years on Earth. It is a story that has been passed down through generations of Lawsons, a reminder that sometimes the greatest love stories begin not with passion or romance, but with a simple act of kindness, with one person choosing to stay when everyone else would have walked away. Kyle Lawson stayed. He claimed Henry as his own, gave Penelope his name and his protection, and built with her a love that lasted a lifetime and beyond. And in the end, that was all that mattered. Not how their story began, but how it unfolded day by day, year by year, choice by choice, until a frightened pregnant woman and a kind cowboy became a family, became partners, became two halves of a whole that nothing could tear apart. The baby Henry grew up never knowing that Kyle was not his biological father, and it would not have mattered if he had. Kyle was his father in every way that counted, in every moment that mattered. He was there for first steps and first words, for skinned knees and broken hearts, for triumphs and failures. He taught Henry to ride and rope and work cattle, taught him to be honest and kind and to keep his word. He showed Henry what it meant to be a man, not by lecturing or preaching, but simply by living his life with integrity and love. And when people in town occasionally whispered about the circumstances of Henry's birth, about how Kyle Lawson had married a pregnant widow and given her child his name, they said it with admiration rather than judgment. Because everyone who knew Kyle and Penelope could see the love between them, could see the strong family they had built, and they understood that this was not a story of shame or scandal, but of redemption and second chances. The Verde Valley Ranch became legendary not just for its success, but for the love story at its foundation, a story that proved that family is not just about blood but about choice, about showing up day after day and choosing to love and protect and nurture the people in your care. Kyle Lawson chose Penelope Nash and her unborn child, and that choice echoed through generations, creating a legacy of love that would endure long after they were both gone from this earth.